Hello, welcome everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. And we're glad that you are joining us for this Data for Nutrition webinar sponsored by the European Commission Joint Research Center and UNICEF about how child wasting has been measured so far. Next slide. So just before we start, I want to make sure that all participants are aware of some logistics. So we do mute all video and microphones during the presentations. And we encourage you to use the Q&A button. So not the chat, but if you look, you'll see a button that says Q&A for questions and answers to submit your questions for the speakers. And at the end, we'll get to as many questions as we can, but you can submit those in real time. And a recording of this webinar will be available immediately on the Data for Nutrition YouTube channel. And the slides and a Q&A summary will be posted in the community in the coming week. So those will be made available to you. Next slide. So today, we are excited to have this joint Data for Nutrition and JRC-UNICEF co-sponsored webinar. Just to remind folks that the Data for Nutrition Community of Practice provides members with opportunities to share knowledge, experience, and questions relevant to strengthening the nutrition data value chain. And we have over 1,000 members. We're continuing to grow and do have some exciting content planned for the coming years as we have some new leadership coming into the Data for Nutrition Community of Practice. So if you're interested in sponsoring a webinar, we do encourage you to reach out and we'd be glad to work with you on that. Today's moderator is Rose Verstanton. She is a scientific officer at the European Joint Research Center. She's led before then the knowledge platform Transform Nutrition West Africa for a number of years. And in her more than 15 years of experience working on nutrition across low and middle income countries, she's really developed an expertise in using evidence-informed decision-making to improve human nutrition and health. So welcome, Rose, and we look forward to the webinar.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. With today's webinar, we aim to achieve clarity on what is known about malnutrition surveillance, so how different anthropometric indicators can be used to estimate acute malnutrition levels, monitor changes, and understand the overall nutrition situation. This is of especially importance for the European Commission as a funding agency, as they need to know how to use the different anthropometric indicators and how their use affects population-based estimates so that they can make better and informed decisions and improve policies. So following engagements with IPC, the Joint Research Center and UNICEF collaborated to analyze a large data set to inform population-based surveillance. And results of this work have been published in a joint report, to which the link will be posted in the chat for your reference after this webinar. As this topic is affecting many of us, I am, without further ado, very excited to introduce the expert of today's webinar. So Estefania Custodio and Amal Ben-Amour will focus on the results of the population-based estimates. And Estefania is a scientific researcher at the National Center of Tropical Medicine in Spain, where she leads a research group on nutrition, resilience, and global health. In her past 6 years' experience, she was a scientific officer at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, where she actually led this research on acute malnutrition indicators. And she's got more than 20 years of experience in global nutrition and food security, with a focus on malnutrition and tropical diseases, stunting prevention, and technical developments for malnutrition and diet-related indicators. Amal Ben-Amour is a nutrition specialist for the West and Central Africa Regional Office. She's based in Dakar and in charge of the prevention and treatment of wasting. So, driven by child rights and gender equality approaches, she brings to nutrition programming her experience in addressing immediate and underlying causes of malnutrition, and this in both humanitarian and development settings. And last but not least, our we have Douglas Jayasekaran, who will share a case study from the IPC in Yemen today with us. He's a nutrition specialist at Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, so IPC, and has over 12 years of experience working on nutrition in Asia and Africa, where he usually focuses on technology for improved nutrition data and programming. He's actually currently working on a mobile app called Rapid MUAC to improve quality and timeliness of MUAC data collected through screening, as well as developing research protocols for testing nutrition data, either through phone interviews or through a traditional household surveys. So to make the most of this webinar, I would encourage you to post, as Rebecca said earlier, your questions in the Q&A box, which I will refer to after the presentations. Estefania, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rose, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you to the Data for Nutrition platform for inviting us to present our results on this webinar. Next slide, please. So I would like to start clarifying the terminology that we are going to be using throughout the presentation and that was used in the report we are presenting. And I will be referring to the note that WHO published this last February in this on the terminology and wasting on acute malnutrition. It says that acute malnutrition encompasses both wasting and edematous malnutrition. That wasting can be measured by a low weight for height or a low middle upper arm circumference or MUAC that can be moderate and severe. And edematous malnutrition measured by nutritional edema. Next slide, please. So when we talk about moderate acute malnutrition or MAM, we are referring to moderate wasting. And when we talk about severe acute malnutrition or SAM, we are referring to severe wasting and or edematous malnutrition. And global acute malnutrition encompasses this all. Next, please. However, in this presentation, we will be referring to global acute malnutrition only based on wasting indicators, as the majority of surveys that we analyzed did not measure edema. Next, please. So more specifically, the wasting indicators that we are going to explore together are these three. So the weight for height Z-score that compares the weight of the child with the weight of a child of the same sex and height from the reference population, being the reference population, the WHO growth standards. We calculate the standard deviation of Z-score, and when it's below -2, we define GAM. Then we have MUAC, that we will be calling absolute MUAC, as is the measurement of the middle upper arm circumference compared to a single cutoff point, not a reference population, is the same cutoff point for children, boys and girls, between 6 and 59 months of age. When that measurement is below 125 millimeters, we talk about GAM. And then we have what we call adjusted MUAC that compares the MUAC of the child being measured with the MUAC of a child of the same sex and age in the reference population. We obtain a standard deviation of Z-score, and when it's below -2, we talk about GAM. Next slide, please. So these three indicators have some advantages and disadvantages, and I will just point out some of the ones that are relevant for this presentation. So the weight for height Z-score, we don't need a precise age of the child. We just need to know that it's below 5 years of age. It's adjusted by sex and height, as we just saw. And then for the GAM prevalence based in this indicator, we have internationally agreed WHO wasting thresholds to make the interpretation from the public health perspective. However, it's more costly to collect than MUAC because you need, for the instrumental, you need to take to the field. Also, you need 2 persons to do the measurement of height. And for most, it's more complex, the interpretations. When you have the measurements, you have to compare to the reference population to obtain the Z-score. However, for absolute MUAC, again, you don't need the precise age. You need to know that the child is above 6 months and below 5 years. You just need a tape to collect it. It's less costly. And foremost, you have a direct interpretation. So when you do the measurement, you have the direct interpretation of the acute malnutrition status of the child. However, it's not adjusted by sex, age, or height, and we don't have specific thresholds for the GAM prevalence based in this indicator. Then we have the adjusted MUAC that shares some of the advantages and the disadvantages of the other two, but it does require a precise age in order to compare it to the reference population. As weight for height is also more complex, the interpretation, as once you do the measurement, you need to compare it to the reference population and obtain the Z-score. And then this indicator has not been frequently used, so we have less information related to how it relates to key outcomes like mortality and morbidity. Now, before continuing, I would like to pose two questions to you, to the audience. So the first poll question, Elena, please next. And can you launch it is, what indicator have you used or have you used in the past more frequently for acute malnutrition screening in the field? Weight for height, absolute MUAC, or adjusted MUAC. You also have the option of both weight for height and MUAC, but I ask you if you can do the exercise of asking, of thinking, which one have you used most and select one of them. Thank you. Okay, so what we see is that MUAC and both weight for height and MUAC for screening. Thank you. Now the next poll question, please. Next slide. Elena. Now the second question is, what indicator have you used more frequently to report or interpret acute malnutrition estimates, GAM estimates at population level? Then it's weight for height, the majority, or also both. Thank you very much for your responses. And this shows exactly what has the reality of historically how these indicators have been used. And as we see, they had different uses that are related to advantages and disadvantages that we just saw. Next slide, please, Alina. And this is the justification of how this study came out. Historically, MUAC was used for program screening and treatment referral along with weight for height, but was not used to estimate GAM at population level. However, in recent years, there are increasing surveys from other sectors than nutrition and health that include an acute malnutrition indicator only MUAC. Unlike the nutrition and health service, we know like SMART or GHS that collect both, these other surveys only collect MUAC, and then we get estimates of GAM based only this indicator. At the same time, in these years, we had increasing evidence on the discrepancy between these acute malnutrition indicators, MUAC and weight for height, when diagnosing acute malnutrition in children. So we needed to have more evidence and also especially to understand from the European Commission how these discrepancies at diagnosis level translated into population estimates. Next slide, please. So this is how this report came out about nutrition surveillance that has mainly three sections. The first one, it's a very detailed description of how the data set was constructed. The second one covers the acute malnutrition diagnosis by the different indicators at individual level. And finally, in section 3, we focus on this acute malnutrition prevalence at population level. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I will just briefly touch on the database construction and then focus the result on the third section. Next slide, please. So about data collection and database construction, just wanted to mention that it was a very long and thorough process. First, in identifying the data sets that not only had the variables in order to construct each of the indicators, but also had information on the survey design and variables that were needed for the analysis. Once the surveys were identified, came the time of harmonizing and cleaning units and names. And I know for most of the audience of the data for nutrition community, this is very familiar with. And then we apply the quality checks in order to see, what surveys could be included, including the SMART possibility checks. And just wanted to mention that we were very strict on the quality that the surveys had to fulfill in order to be included, because we wanted to make sure that results, were based in high quality data. And then when we had the surveys for observations, we kept only those for children that were between 6 and 59 months. So we made sure that all the analysis that we did for the indicators were applied for the same children. And then we had this collated data set that you see there of 680,000 observations. Most of them, as you see, come from Western and Central African countries, then from Middle East, and then from Southern and East Africa. And finally, for Middle East and North Africa, we only have Yemen. Next slide, please. So here you have a more detailed view of where the surveys come from. You see in the map in dark green countries that only had national surveys, middle green countries for which we had national and subnational surveys, and light green countries for which we only had subnational or small scale surveys. And I think this is one of the peculiarities of this study, or the added value, in relation to other studies that have analyzed acute malnutrition indicator based in small scale surveys in humanitarian context. And this study includes large-scale surveys. So we had 135 national and subnational surveys coming from 26 countries. Next, please. Then I will just briefly mention how we calculated the global acute malnutrition prevalences that we are going to show. As you will see in the report for each section and outcomes that we analyzed, we apply different methods in order to improve the robustness of the analysis and results. So for the results that we are going to show here, we had two methods. The first method is that we pulled the data, all the data that we had for a given country, and then we calculated the GAM prevalence for each indicator at the strata or survey domain level. And then we computed the median of those prevalence at country or regional level. And that's what you will see represented as GAM prevalence in the bar graphs. Then we apply a second method, that was that we selected the most recent and complete survey for a given country and computed the GAM prevalence for each indicator at survey level. We did that because we wanted to represent a real life situation scenario where a given survey, real survey, was analyzed by the three different indicators. And then we classify the prevalence according to the Western thresholds, as you will see in the map graphic representation. Next slide, please. So these are the results according to this first method. You will see in the bars always absolute MUAC represented in green, weight for height in purple, and adjusted MUAC in yellow. And here we see that for Southern and East Africa, as well as Yemen, all countries saw the highest GAM prevalence by the adjusted MUAC, while in Western and Central Africa, we see that some countries saw a higher GAM prevalence by weight for height and other by adjusted MUAC. Next slide, please. However, when we do and we stratify the results by age, what we are seeing on the top is the data pulled by region. And again, we have in green the absolute MUAC, and we have solid colors for children, younger children below 2, and striped columns for children 2 years or older. And what we see is that absolute MUAC and weight for height both estimate higher GAM prevalence among younger children. However, the adjusted MUAC estimates a higher GAM prevalence among older children as compared to the GAM prevalence it estimates for the younger children. And the difference between the GAM prevalence estimated by the absolute MUAC as compared to the GAM prevalence for the older children is more marked than for any of the others, not just in the regions, but also in the country data that you see in the three graphs below. Next slide, please. So when we stratify the results by sex, we see that it's now the weight for height and the adjusted MUAC that show the same pattern. In the solid colors, we have girls, and in the striped columns, we have the boys. So weight for height, purple, and adjusted MUAC show a higher GAM prevalence among boys than among girls, whereas the absolute MUAC shows a higher GAM prevalence among girls than among boys. So depending on the indicator we are using to estimate the GAM prevalence, we will see one or other group more affected. And this pattern is repeated also at the country level, as you see below. Next slide, please. Finally, we did a stratification by stunting that we have the data for East and Southern Africa and West and Central Africa. And what we see here in the solid columns, we have the stunted children as compared to non-stunted children in the striped columns. And we see that for every region, for every indicator and every country, always GAM prevalence is higher among the stunted children, and that the difference between the GAM prevalence in the stunted children as compared to the non-stunted children is more marked for MUAC-based indicators. So I will end here the presentation of results based in method 1, and I hand it over to Amal to give you the results based in method 2 and next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefania. So now we're going to look at what happens when we apply the WHO wasting threshold to GAM prevalences when it's measured by MUAC indicators. So Next slide, please. As you can see, this is the West Central African region, and you have the colors from light pink to the darker one, showing really the classification from very low to very high GAM. And so when we apply WHO wasting threshold that are made for weight for height to the GAM prevalence that have been estimated by absolute MUAC, the interpretation of the nutrition situation can be misleading. And as you can see, for example, countries like Burkina Faso or Mauritania or Senegal would be classified as high or medium GAM prevalence according to weight for height in the left map, but low or very low prevalence according to MUAC. Next slide, please. So if we do the same with MUAC, adjusted MUAC, so although these two maps show some similar results, when we apply still the WHO threshold to the GAM prevalence by adjusted MUAC, there's also some misleading interpretation of the nutrition situation that needs to be considered. As you can see, those discrepancies between weight for height and MUAC measurements are not only due to the sex and age adjustment, since this is what the methodology of adjusted MUAC does. So next slide, please. In terms of really, in summary, what we can say from the studies that population estimates of acute malnutrition differ greatly depending on the indicator used to measure it. So depending on the indicator used, either girls versus boys or younger versus older children seem to be more affected. We cannot definitely use the WHO threshold to classify the severity of acute malnutrition situation when we use MUAC-based indicators, as really the results are not equivalent. And finally, sex and age adjustments are not only the only factor that affects this discrepancy between weight for height and MUAC-based indicators. And in terms of, next slide, please, takeaways. From the report, definitely weight for height and MUAC measurements, they identify different manifestations of acute malnutrition. The indicator used to diagnose acute malnutrition need to be systematically mentioned when we do report results and analysis. Are we using weight for height? Are we using MUAC? So it helps us really with the right interpretation. And the use of WHO prevalence population threshold may provide incorrect classification on the severity of acute malnutrition when we compare this with prevalence based on MUAC measurement. So for MUAC-based prevalence, the population threshold developed by the IPC classification may be more appropriate, and we will have a case study from Douglas in a couple of minutes. And then for better interpretation, of course, whenever it's possible, results should be disaggregated by age and sex. Finally, for nutrition surveillance at population level, the use of a combined indicator that includes children identified as acutely malnourished by weight for height and MUAC should be further explored and validated through further research. So thank you very much for this, and I'll pass it on to Douglas for your presentation on the IPC.
Thanks, Amar. So I'm going to talk about how these different acute malnutrition indicators are used in the IPC acute malnutrition classifications. But for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with the IPC acute malnutrition, IPC acute malnutrition is a situation analysis tool. And as the name suggests, it focuses on the analysis of acute malnutrition. It's mainly used to inform the humanitarian program cycle, like HNO, HRP, but it's also used in used in other situations as well. So in the IPC acute malnutrition analysis, areas are classified based on the severity of acute malnutrition. And then key drivers to acute malnutrition in each of the areas classified are identified. And then also based on the these two recommendations are provided to address acute malnutrition. So in this presentation, I'm only going to focus on the classification part. I'm not going to cover how drivers are identified, recommendations are made, or the results are used. As I said before, we use, in terms of classification, we use both weight for height and MUAC. In some cases, we use both of them to do the classification. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we use weight for height in IPC acute malnutrition analysis to classify areas? For weight for height, we do have thresholds that specify what classifies them into one of the 5 IPC phases. Phase 1 being acceptable and phase 5 being extremely critical. So these thresholds are already available globally and used in various programs. For example, the weight for height 30% or more is used in the famine classifications, as you may already know. Next slide, please. So in the absence of internationally agreed thresholds, how do we use MUAC in the IPC acute malnutrition classification? So the IPC partnership developed the thresholds for MUAC, but using survey data, comparing weight for height and MUAC from these survey data. The more than 600 surveys were included in this analysis, but without going into further details, as you can see, MUAC can be higher or lower or similar to weight for height, depending on the context where the data is coming from, right? So the maximum we could do is we could only come up with thresholds, what we call overlapping thresholds. So what it means is that any MUAC prevalence can only indicate 2 IPC acute malnutrition phases. I'll use an example next to illustrate this further. Next slide, please. So, as I said before, to summarize, for weight for height, we have mutually exclusive thresholds for each of the 5 IPC acute malnutrition phases. But for MUAC, we only have thresholds that overlapping thresholds that cover two phases. So when you are using MUAC to do a phase classification in IPC acute malnutrition analysis, we can't not just rely on the thresholds itself. We need to also look at some other factors to make the decision. So the other 2 information we rely on or we use in the IPC acute malnutrition classifications are, 1, considering the relationship between weight for height and MUAC in the area that we are classifying. And secondly, we also look at the risk factors, how the risk factors have behaved or developed between the past and the present before we make the final decision about the actual IPC AMN phase based on the MUAC prevalence. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is an example from where MUAC was used to classify the severity of acute malnutrition. This is from Yemen. In one of the governorates called East Damar in Yemen, when we did the IPC acute malnutrition analysis back in 2020, all we had was MUAC prevalence, and it was 6.6%. So as you saw earlier, for any given MUAC prevalence, we can only say it could be between 2 phases, right? So for a MUAC prevalence of 6.6%, it could be phase 2 or it could be phase 3. That's all we can say by just looking at the thresholds that we have for MUAC in IPC acute malnutrition reference table. So the second step is we need to know in this particular context whether MUAC is always higher than weight for height or lower than weight for height or similar to weight for height. Luckily, we had 3 surveys that were done previously. So we had data from weight for height and MUAC for this area. So from the survey of 2013, you can see while weight for height was 4.9%, MUAC was 10.1%. And then in 2018, weight for height was 5.9% and MUAC was 8.9%. In 2019, while weight for height, they were both similar, 10.3%. So it's quite difficult to work with these numbers, prevalence estimates. So we convert them into IPC phases. So 2013, weight for height, since we have the phase specific thresholds, we can say it's phase 1 based on weight for height. In 28, for the 2018 estimate, you can see it's phase 2 based on weight for height, and 2019 we can say it's phase 3 based on the weight for height thresholds, right? So in terms of MUAC, again, we can't say it's one phase because we don't have thresholds for each of the 5 phases. We can, for 2013, it could be phase 2, 3, or phase 4. In 2018, it could be phase 2 or 3. And again, in 2019, it could be phase 3 or phase 4. So now we can compare the relationship between weight for height and MUAC in terms of phases, right? So even though MUAC can be in 2 phases, one lower phase and one upper phase, in this particular context, MUAC is, in terms of MUAC phase, it's always associated with the lower end of the 2 phases compared to weight for height. So we have some evidence now to say that even though in 2020, based on the prevalence of 6.6%, it could be phase 2 or phase 3, it's more likely to be phase 2 rather than phase 3 because of the historical relationship between weight for height and MUAC in this area. So we call it indicative phase, but we don't stop there. We also review the how the contributing factors or the risk factors have evolved between the past and the present. So in this particular case, there was no significant difference between the risk factors between the past and the present. So the area was classified into phase 2, which according to IPC acute malnutrition terminology, it's alert. Next slide, please. So we do have, I mean, as I said, we use both weight for height and MUAC in the IPC acute malnutrition phase classification. But whenever we use MUAC to do the final phase classification, we also use that, show that in our communication products. So MUAC-based classification will be always highlighted in hash lines, whereas weight for height-based classification will be always highlighted in solid colors. So as you can see, in 2020, we only had MUAC, so the areas are highlighted in hash lines. And then in 2022, when we had the weight for height estimate, or classification was based on weight for height, we are showing solid colors, right? Next slide, please. So there are some additional resources if you are interested in. There is an IPC website. You can go www.ipcinfo.org. And we also have a technical manual describing all I said and also plus additional things. You can download it from the IPC website. We also have introductory IPC acute malnutrition online courses, and also general introduction to IPC. If you are interested in, you will have to go to the website, register, and you can follow the courses on your own time. Thank you.
Thank you all to all presenters for these very on time and interesting presentations. With this, I'd like to remind everyone who's attending the webinar to please use the Q&A button to submit your questions to the speakers, and if possible, direct your questions to a specific speaker. As a reminder, answers to all questions will be shared in a written Q&A summary that will then be shared in the coming weeks by the organizers of the webinar. So again, thank you to all presenters for these very interesting presentations, and you were already providing some questions and concerns in the Q&A. So we've sorted through them and received some questions that I'll be addressing, as many as we can during this discussion. And I will be posing them to our panelists. So a first question, I'll start with Douglas, is, can you extend the thresholds to the project level? For example, is under 5% malnutrition at a school feeding an acceptable level? Douglas?
Okay, thanks, Ruth, and thanks for the question. All these thresholds are based on data from children 6 to 59 months, right? So when you say school feeding programs, I assume you are referring to a different age group. So it may not be possible to use the same thresholds for other groups, other population subgroups. And in IPC, we just focus on the 6 to 59 months age group. But again, I'm not sure about the project level. If you are referring to projections, yes, in IPC, we do also look at how the situation is likely to evolve during the next season or next few months. In that case, yes, we do the projection analysis. Over.
Thank you, Douglas. Another question that is addressed to you, just to tie in with the other presenters, is how is combined GAM prevalence used in IPC AMN? So for the GAM based on low MUAC, low weight for height, or presence of edema?
Yes. So at the moment, we do only have thresholds for weight for height. We have thresholds for MUAC. We don't have thresholds for combined weight for height combined global acute malnutrition prevalence. So we don't do classifications at the moment based on combined global acute malnutrition. However, we do use combined GAM prevalence to estimate the burden of acute malnutrition. We as part of the IPC acute malnutrition analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. I'll now come back to a question for Estefania. So the question is, if the use of risk factors to reconcile between the two estimates is potentially very interesting. And so there was this, sorry, I'm trying to find my question. Yeah, so are the risk factors the same as mentioned in the WHO classification? Estefania, this one is addressed to you.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the question is if the risk factors are the same as mentioned in the WHO classification. That is the question. So if I understand it correctly, it's about the use of risk factors to reconcile between the two estimates.
Okay, I think that that is something that is used in the IPC methodology. That is what Douglas mentioned. So I think I better leave him to answer that.
Okay.
I mean, they are based in the nutrition, in the UNICEF nutrition framework of causes. But I think it's referring to what Douglas just mentioned, that in order to do the convergence of evidence between GAM by MUAC and weight for height, one of the things they do is, as well as looking at historical data, look at the risk factors. So I don't know if Douglas wants to add something on that.
In IPC, we use the conceptual framework on malnutrition to come up with possible risk factors to acute malnutrition. And these are we go through each of them. There is a list of risk factors. We go through all of them during the IPC AMN analysis, and then we identify the most relevant one for that context we are doing the analysis, right? So these risk factors will help us, one, also, as I mentioned before, to decide on the severity of acute malnutrition based on MUAC or GAM based on MUAC. And two, they also help us to do the projection analysis. So how likely the situation is going to evolve in the next few months or next season. So those are the two ways we use the risk factors in the IPC acute malnutrition analysis. Over.
Thank you, Douglas. So here's what I do think are questions for Stefania. So someone is asking if you compare the trends of GAM when measured by MUAC or by weight for height Z-score. So in other words, if we observe a deterioration of GAM measured by MUAC, can we assume there's a deterioration of GAM measured by weight for height Z-score for surveillance purpose?
Yeah, thank you, Rose, and thank you for this question. I think that what our results show is that what is really important is that when we are analyzing trends, we are making sure that the GAM we are comparing is based in the same indicator, or that we take into account, as Douglas said, that the phase classification according to other factors. As otherwise, we might be seeing a trend, from GAM prevalence in the past to one in the present that has changed, and it's due to the indicator we are using instead of real change situation. I hope that answers the question. Over.
Thank you. There's one more for Estefania. Do you think we can identify country or regional patterns of the relationship between weight for height Z and MUAC?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. As we didn't have to comment on everything that is in the report, but it's something that we mentioned in the report. As we did also in section 2, we also analyzed the results based in the discrepancies in diagnosis, and we did that also at country level. And the thing is that, sometimes the results that we were getting, and we compared to other studies that have looked at the same thing, were not the same. For some of the countries that we had, that weight for height was identifying more acute malnutrition children than MUAC. In other studies, like the one that was developed by Gridley and Golden, or the one developed by the CDC, for the same country, the relationship was the other way around. So I think this deserves more attention and research. But there's a detailed section in this in the report where we compare results to other studies, and although in some countries the relationship is the same, in some others the relationship is reversed. So I think it might be more related to the sample, the characteristics of the sample you're studying, than to any intrinsic characteristic of the country itself. Thank you, Over.
Thank you. As a follow-up, Estefania, for you, there's some more methodological question. One is, you said that in the database construction, you applied smart plausibility checks, but I did not see the age ratio plausibility check specifically mentioned. Did you use it?
Well, thank you for this. Yeah, and again, it was not specifically mentioned as we didn't have time for it. But yes, as you probably know, and probably that's why this question is posed, because many times it's the most problematic, one of the most problematic. And it was so in the surveys that we analyzed, because we actually did analyze the plausibility checks SMART one by one. We didn't do like the calculation that does of the mean of the different criteria, but one by one. And the age distribution in the surveys we analyzed was the one that showed more problems. And it was like in more than around 50% of the surveys we were analyzing, the age distribution in the categories was not as expected. And actually, we also tell in detail in the report that this, it was not as expected, as the age category of children below 2 was consistently higher in most of the surveys analyzed than the category of children, older children. So I think what we finally did is we did not split surveys because of that, and we introduced the stratification by age in order to overcome this this problem. But we also highlight the importance of making sure that when we are doing surveys of children below 5 years of age, that the older children, the 3 to 5 years old, are well represented. Over.
Thank you. Another question, I'll address it to Stefania first, but I do think that Amal and Douglas could chip in if they want to. A question asked is, have you tried plotting ROC curves to set a new cutoff of MUAC for weight for height? That score -2. The person who asked the question says that they did this in Nepal and the cutoff was about 138 mm. What do you think about this?
Yes, we didn't do that. As you will see in the report as well, that's some of the things of the further research that can be done also with this data set that we constructed, but we didn't go into it. We didn't do that. Over. Douglas, do you have any further thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah, when we were developing the thresholds for when we were trying to come up with the thresholds for MUAC also, we didn't go into the ROC curve. However, because our purpose is to use the prevalence to come up with the possible thresholds for MUAC. Also to say that to respond to one of the previous questions, whether there is better thresholds we can come up with for regions and country-specific thresholds. Yeah, that was done. But the conclusion is that no, it's not. Even if you do the same analysis at the regional level or country level, comparing weight for height and MUAC, there is no clear relationship between weight for height and MUAC. This is why we ended up having these broad thresholds. Then we go area by area and apply the thresholds and look at the relationship between the two indicators in that particular area and finalize our phase. Over.
Thank you both. Amal, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add, and I'll leave the floor to you, but there's a specific question asked for you, which is what kind of additional research would be helpful to advance this discussion. So feel free to add to the current question or to the previous one.
Thank you, Rose. No, I'll definitely add into the further research that is needed, and there are various topics here that we can discuss, but definitely the fact that we would need to really identify children who are more at risk of mortality. And we know that this research found that, children with wasting and stunting are at higher risk of mortality. So how do we go with that and try to investigate more about, acute malnourishment using all those indicators. Other types of research and innovations around, weight for height data collection. What can we do in order to make it more practical and feasible to collect actually high quality data, and especially for the height to really make it possible to measure weight for height for nutrition surveillance among communities. I think the other aspect would be also more in general that there's definitely, and I think Douglas, you said it, that there's a need to really contextualize and have practical consideration that are more context specific, and yes, the study is more about surveillance on data and analysis, but for programmatic adaptation, for decisions that need to be taken, it's important to really consider the context in which we work. And finally, I think the fact that there's some discussions on how to best measure children with SAM and MAM, and also the ones under 6 months. These discussions are ongoing. There's the WHO recommendation, which will be definitely of interest, and they're including really key findings and also the research gap that have been identified during the review process. So definitely something to keep an eye on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Amal. There's before we close off with some final remarks and input from the DFN, there's a final question for Stefania. What is the magnitude of the differences in GAM when you consider children identified as malnourished by 2 indicators? Over to you.
Thank you. I guess that this question relates, is asking what is the magnitude when we use the combined indicator, no? Children that are either identified as acutely malnourished by weight for height or by any of the MUAC indicators. We have also a table comparing this in the report. For that, we use the method number 2, as well as that I presented here. That is that we selected the most updated and most completed survey from a given country in order to provide like a real survey the scenario and responses, and we did that for the West African, Central African countries for WCAR. And we compare like the prevalence by weight per height with the prevalence of a combined indicator that would say that would identify children acutely malnourished as weight per height and MUAC, absolute MUAC. And that is in page 37 of the report. But you see that the magnitude of the difference, the highest one is 5 percentage points, but most of them are between 1 and 3 percentage points of the difference. So I think that Amal already mentioned that it's something that is, that we should further explore and validate these preferences by combined indicators. But in this first test that we did, that's the results that we obtained. When we do the combined indicator with the adjusted MUAC, prevalences are much higher. I think that by looking at the report, you will find very detailed information of this. Thank you.
Thank you. So to ask some final word or input from each speaker, bearing in mind that the relationship is different between, or seems to differ by context and country, perhaps this demonstrates that MUAC and weight for height Z-scores are measuring quite fundamentally different things. So a question asked by one of the attendants is it really useful to use one as a proxy for another one or any more? And the question is addressed to, I would love to hear from each of the speakers their ideas on this. I'll start with Douglas.
Well, ideally, we should have, thresholds for combined prevalence. And then we can see, okay, we can really look at the severity and compare it with the different populations. But the problem is that as it is, we don't have data on weight for height and MUAC at the same time. In some cases we only have MUAC. In some cases we have weight for height, and some cases we do have weight for height and MUAC, right? So that's one problem. So when you only have MUAC, we need to also have a way to come up with the classification and based on the severity. So this is why I think we need to have the different options, so that depending on what we have in terms of data, we can use them and show the severity. While I'm there, I just wanted to also highlight whether the shocks affect acute malnutrition, weight for height and MUAC similarly or not. This is an interesting one. We also have looked into it. In general, it seems to be the case. It affects them more or less the same way in many areas. Where we don't see this pattern, it's mainly to do with the quality of the MUAC measurements. So when you look at the quality of the MUAC measurements, it's we have very strict or very very solid quality checks for weight for height, but for MUAC not necessarily. So sometimes it's to do with the quality of MUAC measurements also to keep in mind. Over.
Thank you, Douglas. Another final thought or remark is coming from someone who's a nutrition advisor that works at project level, who thinks that or feels that these webinars are high level, heavy in technical language, and sometimes difficult to comprehend and draw practical application for projects or programs in real life. So he or she was wondering whether you could share any final advice to close off the webinar for project implementers who are actually meant to apply research like this. So what's the takeaway for programs? And I'm hoping that Amal as well as Stefania can chip in with some final remarks on this. Thanks.
Okay, I'll go first and maybe also, you know, kind of relate to this comment, because it is, I mean, it is at the end of the day, we want like some practical key takeaways and be able to do better programming. And I think we're all on the same page as you on this. I think, I mean, I'm just going to reiterate once again that definitely more research is needed in this field. It's very difficult to like that's not the purpose of today to say there's one measurement better than the other and you should do this. I think it's very context specific. We encourage really countries to make their own analysis of the data that they're collecting. There's rich data that we're doing on a regular basis. I'm thinking about the SMART surveys where we collect really, you know, information about weight, about height, about age, about MUAC as well. So there is still, I think, richness that needs to be analyzed and further discussed to be able to really come up with some clear guidance on how we can do better nutrition programming. And again, I think the fact, or nutrition surveillance as well, right? And so the fact that, again, we're following WHO recommendation, that they're really taking an interest in updating the guidance and looking at where the gaps were in the previous protocol and trying to address that, I think it's it should be really a big step forward for nutrition programming. And maybe Stefania, if you have anything else to add, but I think researchers and implementers like us should keep working together, because this is what makes it more evidence-based as well. So yeah, over to you, Stefania.
Thank you. I would just make it very brief. I think that the message that we wanted to pass over, the simple message, is also related to the previous question. That is, yes, that the MUAC and the weight for height, they are measuring different manifestations of acute malnutrition. Thus, they are not interchangeable, but they are complementary. So what I would say is, for program or for surveillance, that the takeaway message is that we should always know, we should report which indicator is behind the acute malnutrition that we are reporting, that we should stratify by age, as we see that it has such an importance, also by sex and stunting status. So we should report it by indicating it, or we should ask for it when someone reports this to us. And that, I think, is like the message that we wanted to give behind this research. Thank you, Over.
With that, actually, I would like to thank all of the presenters for their presentations, their responses to the questions, and as well as the audience for asking these very interesting questions. I'd like to hand over to Rebecca now for some final closure. Thank you.
Well, we just really want to say thank you to all of you who joined the webinar today, and especially to our moderator and our speakers. Do want to remind you that if you're interested in having your work or a topic that you're interested in a webinar, please reach out. We can provide technical support and really do want to feature as many opportunities as possible. So a recording of the webinar is now available on the Data for Nutrition YouTube channel, and we will do share copies of the presentations as well as a summary of the Q&A, including those that were not able to be answered live. on the group Data for Nutrition page in the coming week. So thank you for enjoying today's webinar, and do hope you have a lovely weekend.